You're welcome back to Breakfast Central. Since the 28th of February 2026, the United States, alongside Israel, has carried out strikes on Iranian military and nuclear sites, killing hundreds, including senior officials and even Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The United Nations Secretary General has condemned the offensive as a grave threat to international peace and security.
Critics argue that these actions exceed presidential authority, that they violate the UN Charter and constitute unlawful aggression. Now, to help us unpack the legal dimensions, we're being joined by visiting professor of legal studies at York University Abu Dhabi, Professor Sual Takahashi. Good morning. Good morning, Professor Sual. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, good morning. Hi. Sorry, I was muted.
All right.
Hello.
Let's get to the legality of this first of all. Article 2, sub 4 of the UN Charter prohibits the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council approval. Do the U.S. strikes meet either condition?
Well, clearly they don't. I mean, that's a very, very easy question, or rather a question with a very, very easy answer. I mean, there is absolutely zero legal justification for what the U.S. and Israel have been doing in their attacks against Iran. Under international law, there is absolutely zero justification. So that's very simple. The UN Charter basically prohibits the use of force, or it should be noted, the threat of the use of force. These are prohibited unless there is an express Security Council authorization, or there is also an exception in cases of self-defense. But when it comes to this self-defense, I mean, there are a number of different things that have to be fulfilled, that have to be met. And for sure, the U.S. or neither the U.S. nor Israel has fulfilled those criteria. So, there's absolutely no question that this is completely an imperialist war, which is being waged without any kind of legal justification whatsoever.
Okay, all right. But is preventive self-defense, like we see in this case, that is, striking before an attack occurs, is it legally recognized or is it unlawful aggression?
Well, it's legally recognized in cases where an attack is clear, when it's imminent, and when, for example, attacking first may be the only way to prevent the attack. But that's clearly not the case here. The United States, the explanation that Trump and his gang have put forward seem to change by the day, if not by the hour. But they're saying that, Iran was just weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon, that they would have struck Europe, but they would have struck the United States. There's absolute zilcho evidence for any of this, as the IEA has already mentioned. And, even supposing Iran was close to developing a nuclear weapon, which, I repeat myself, there's absolutely no evidence that that's the case. But even if that were the case, that doesn't justify the U.S. just going ahead and bombing places and bombing civilian infrastructure. No way. So, those criteria are nowhere met in what the U.S. and Israel have been doing. And while we're talking about nuclear weapons, I think it's important to mention the elephant in the room, which is that there is one country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons and is widely recognized and understood to have them, and that is Israel. And somehow, this is perfectly fine. Somehow the U.S. and the West are perfectly fine with Israel having nuclear weapons and having a nuclear deterrence. And yet any other country in the region, well, this is a big problem. It's a threat to international peace and security. So here we see these double standards at play once again in how the international community, quote unquote, deals with these kind of situations, in particular in the Middle East.
Professor Takahashi, from our discussion so far this morning, what I could say is it brings to mind the famous quote by Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, that the old world is dead, the new world emerges. Now is the time of monsters, because we've seen the precedent in the last few months. First, it was Venezuela. The United States went in, kidnapped the sitting head of state and his wife. And since then, we've not heard anything about drugs, because they extrajudicially killed people off the Venezuelan coast, claiming there were boats that were taking drugs to the United States. And now we're seeing their action play out in Iran, over 1,000 people have been dead, 165 young girls were massacred. And there are those that say, you know, Professor, you're a professor of international law. They say, what is the point of even studying international law if you're going to have states just ignore it and do their will? What's your response to this?
Well, I ask myself the same question every day. And of course, many of my students raise the same questions. That's a very difficult one. For sure, the old international order is like Gramsci, like the quote from Gramsci you mentioned. The old international order appears to be, completely done for. And this predates what Trump did in Venezuela. It goes back to, I would argue, Gaza. And the sheer double standards at play, the sheer double standards that were exposed in an even more brutal fashion, whereby Russia, every one of us is supposed to jump up and down on our desks and scream about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which of course was a violation of international law, no question. And yet, when the West's dear little Israel commits live stream genocide throughout Palestine, it's fine, they have the right to defend themselves and it's perfectly fine. So this kind of hypocrisy is really what has brought the old international system down. The problem is, that hypocrisy was built into the system. And, just look at the Security Council and how it's set up. Like we mentioned before, the UN Charter explicitly states that the Security Council is the only international body that can decide on the use of force, that can legitimately instruct UN member states to use force to enforce international law. But the Security Council, to use a word that Trump uses very often, is rigged. It is rigged in favor of the 5 countries that were on the winning side in World War II, each one of them with veto rights. And as we saw, again, in very brutal fashion throughout the genocide in Gaza, which is still continuing, the U.S. using its veto rights to prevent any kind of action, even any kind of condemnation of Israel for its atrocities. So it was built into the system. And, what's happening now is, of course, terrible. We are definitely in the time of monsters, like Gramsci said, there's no question. And we look and see the so-called board of peace that Trump has established, something which is just him and his buddies looking for ways to extend their domination and enrich their pockets. So we are in the time of monsters, and for sure things like arrangements like the board of peace are not the answer. But I think it's important for us to understand that international law, as it was made and as it was developed, even after World War II, still favored the imperialist countries, the imperialist West, and that's really what has to change. Countries outside of the West, what many refer to as the global South, and of course Nigeria is a very important country amongst those countries. These countries are really sick of this hypocrisy and these kind of double standards. So I'm very much hoping that that there will be a very serious movement towards revamping international law, or at least the international structures that we have that are meant to enforce international law, so that we can create something which is a system which is much more democratic and which in fact, enforces and applies international law in an equal way.
All right. The late Ayatollah, his son, has been now chosen as the supreme leader. He'll be the 3rd Khamenei of Iran. So the question now is, we've seen the reaction of the United States president. He's expressed displeasure. Should he typically be involved or, be able to decide who the next leader is? Let's speak to the legality or otherwise of this.
Well, I mean, in terms of legality, of course not. I mean, this is just a sick joke. I mean, Trump thinks that he is Marlon Brando in The Godfather, and that he can push everyone around to do his bidding. And what really makes this the time of monsters? I mean, American presidents clearly have been doing this kind of thing, for quite a long time after World War II. But what really makes this, I would say, the time of monsters is that, he's not hiding it. he's just, openly stating these kind of things, brazenly ignoring the right of self-determination and sovereignty of the Iranian people. And of course, this is very much normal for him. I mean, if you look at what he's been trying to do in Gaza, openly stating that the U.S. is just going to own Gaza, that we are going to develop it as the next Riviera of the Middle East, no doubt very lucrative real estate development deals which will benefit the Trump family. I mean, this is just insane. I mean, it's crazy. Nowhere in his so-called 20-point plan for Gaza is there any mention of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. Nowhere is there any kind of suggestion that Palestinians really have rights. So, this is just very much to the par for Trump and for the current, the people in power in the United States. But, what's happening now, in a way, you could just say it's just what has been happening behind the scenes for a long time now is just very much coming into the open. The fact that it had to take place behind the scenes before is meaningful in a way, because it means that there was a facade, and countries, even the powerful countries felt that facade should at least be maintained. In most cases, in the cases of Palestine, not really, but in most cases, the facade, efforts were made to maintain this facade. Now there's no facade whatsoever. We are really in, the law of the jungle. Might makes right, and that is Trump's law. That's how Trump operates, like a mafioso. So, it's unsurprising to hear those kind of statements from him, but it's of course, unacceptable for sure, legally and by any perspective, really.
All right, we'll go on a quick break. When we come back, I'd like us to look at another aspect. What does this mean for other nations, such as Russia, North Korea, even China? Can we say that they would have any justification if they just wake up in the morning and decide to do what they want? But do stay with us. After the break, we'll discuss this. Thanks for staying with us here on Breakfast Central. We're looking at the conversation concerning the war in the Middle East, and we do have our very interesting guest, a visiting professor of legal studies at York University Abu Dhabi, Professor Sual Takahashi. Just before the break, I asked a question. With what America has done, does this in any way give credence to countries like Russia, China, North Korea, to simply justify any action they may decide to take in the near future against another sovereignty?
I mean, if what we're living in is the law of the jungle, that means that there is no law. There is nothing protecting the sovereignty or rights of any country, really. And the strong can do what they want, and the weak have no choice except to be subjugated by the strong. That's what the law of the jungle means. And that's precisely where we are now. Now,
Okay.
Donald Trump and his ilk in the United States think that that's just hunky-dory, because they have the strongest military in the world. They can do whatever they want. They can impose their will on anybody else. So the law of the jungle suits them just fine, they think. But they're going to have a very rude awakening very soon, I believe, because it's not going to go that way.
I mean, it's a sad realization of what we've come to. But finally, before we wrap up this conversation, Professor Takahashi, for the sake of our viewers, what are the rules of engagement? Because we have over 1,000 dead Iranians, mostly civilians. So far, we had a school that was bombed. What does international law say about rules of engagements in a war like this? Yesterday, Iranians woke up to a black rain after an oil facility was struck. We've also seen reports of stadiums, oil facilities, schools, UNESCO World Heritage sites. Are there rules governing what can be hit and what cannot be hit? And also the airport in Tehran, the main airport, was hit by the American bombs yesterday.
Well, for sure there are rules. There is a whole body of law called international humanitarian law, which are essentially the laws of war. And the big rule here is that civilians or civilian objects cannot be targeted. So schools are obviously civilian objects. Schools, hospitals, stadiums, oil refineries, these kind of things are, these are civilian objects, and they should not be targeted. And I think what's very frightening, another thing that's very concerning is that what we're seeing is potentially the U.S. and Israel going for the Gazification of Tehran and perhaps the rest of Iran, where basically they just go out and without any abandon, any kind of restraint, and go and commit atrocities left and right. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, now he's so proud of himself by calling himself the Secretary of War. He basically stated as much. He has stated on several occasions that these rules that are supposed to constrain us are bogus, that we don't need them, we've done away with them, we've loosened the rules of engagement so that our warriors can go and act like they're playing video games. I mean, it's again, the U.S. and Israel have, in fact, for quite a long time now, for decades, have been lobbying to change the rules of war and change the rules that are applicable when they go out and bomb other countries, and to sort of loosen these wars and give them a freer hand in conducting these kind of military operations. That hasn't happened yet, but it's clear the contempt with which certainly Israel for decades and now the United States, the contempt in which they hold these rules, any kind of rules, any kind of international norms, is very, very clear, and we can see that from the bombing of the girls' school in Tehran and from the bombing of all these civilian facilities. It's just another nail in the coffin, I fear, of the international order as we know it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sual Takahashi, for joining us and explaining deeply the international laws governing this particular situation that the world is actually witnessing. Thanks for your time and thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.